From CareCredit, it's Care Experts, a podcast where we dive deep into the health and pet care industry with the professionals that make it happen. I'm Antonio Diaz, and this is Logan. There's nothing sweeter than the bond between kids and their dogs. It can be joyful, playful, and seriously heartwarming. But just like with siblings or best friends, even the strongest bond needs a little guidance. A few simple tips can go a long way in building trust and keeping everyone safe. One thing I've seen time and time again as a trainer is how much people underestimate the importance of teaching both children and dogs how to interact safely. That's why I'm so grateful to have Dr. Kathy Wiederkehr with us today. With over 25 years of experience as a veterinarian, she's seen firsthand what can happen on the medical side when that guidance is missing. Together, we'll cover what to teach, how to teach it, and how to create a safe, respectful environment for both your child and your dog. Let's get into it. Dr. Kathy, I'm so excited to have you here today. This is a topic that I can talk about forever, so I hope you have the time. But this is something I deal with a lot in my career, kids and dogs interacting and trying to, paint a clear path for parents and owners to deal with these issues correctly. And I'm sure you have your own experiences that I'd love to hear about today.
Well, Antonio, it's really me who's excited to be here because you really are the expert. So I have a lot of questions for you too.
What's your experience with kids and dogs interacting?
Probably like you, I grew up around dogs.
Yep.
My kids grew up around my dogs and cats too. So really understanding how they interact safely is key to everything, to making it a pleasant experience for both the dog and the children too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a great bunch of ideas we can talk about that might direct people in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, one to start with is some ways that kids misunderstand dogs. So there's a lot of behaviors that dogs do that kids tend to misunderstand. Like for me, I would say barking is one of them. A lot of times when a dog is barking, even in a playful manner, a kid can be a little bit taken back by that, a little nervous or insecure and afraid.
Let's talk about tail wagging.
Yes.
What does that really mean?
It means a lot of things. So one thing I'll say is that there was a study done, I want to say about a little more than 10 years ago, and they learned that when a dog meets somebody, dog or person, if the tail wags more to the left, that this is a sign that the dog is actually not certain, not comfortable, or a little weary of the individual that they're interacting with. We'll say unfamiliar. When the tail wags to the right, that's a sign that the dog is more comfortable and more familiar with. So from our perspective, if we meet a dog and we see that their tail is more wagging to our right, that's an indication that the dog isn't totally comfortable with or familiar with us.
That is a very fun fact. And I'm going to go look at every dog I see in my practice now and see which side they wag on. So what are different barks actually mean for dogs?
Yeah, so with playful dogs or a dog that's in a playful state, usually you're going to get like high pitch barking.
Okay.
So that's usually, and we can also kind of put that in the demand barking category. So think about when a dog really wants you to throw like a toy or a ball. They tend to have this squeaky bark, right? That it's very high pitched versus a dog that's in a more protective state has a little bit of a lower bark, more serious and intentional. Mm-hmm. That's a big one. And I see oftentimes kids get startled by that. Another one, for example, is dogs that are just being playful and coming up into a child's space in their face. I've seen a lot of kids that let's say they want to interact with a dog, but they're not expecting the dog to come up into their face. And one thing I always tell my clients is that a dog usually wants to smell their breath. I know Logan does that a lot.
Oh, is that why they like your face?
That's one of the reasons why they get close to your face, because it's a little weird. But let's say our breath, our backside, when a dog smells that, that's like us. So they're really trying to get to know us as people. So a lot of times kids get very nervous because a dog comes right up and wants to be in their face.
Smell their breath, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Logan does that a lot too.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I guess that's probably a lot for some children to absorb.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe there's some good guidelines we can give to kids in general so they don't have to interpret all the behavior.
Yeah. Well, I would say I think parents should be involved in all the interactions between kids and dogs. It's easy to kind of romanticize the idea of kids and dogs, getting together. I see it all the time. People, posting videos of children and dogs together. And it is very sweet, especially when they're getting along well. But oftentimes people just don't really see some of the more subtle signs of a dog that's a little bit stressed, or not understanding that the kid is putting a little bit of too much pressure on the dog and making them uncomfortable. And that's something that I think just from a safety perspective, most people need to become more aware of.
Well, I know there are certain triggers that would set a dog off to be uncomfortable, like food or toys. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, before we jump into that, I want to say too, some signs that would make a dog uncomfortable or confused from a child, right? So a lot of times, and when I'm working with clients with dogs and kids running around and screaming, these are normal behaviors for children, but from a dog's perspective, they might be confused by them or uncomfortable, might read the situation a little bit differently. So what I often teach my clients is to prepare their dogs in a more controlled fashion. So intentionally asking the kids to run around and play and scream and do their thing, so you can observe the dog and see where the dog is.
Oh.
Because sometimes dogs, they do what I call policing behaviors. So if a child is running around with their friends, the dog might try and bark at them to stop them, or maybe herd them in a certain direction. So these are also behaviors that people would label as potentially aggressive, when it's really not aggression per se. It's more like the dog going into work mode.
Right.
So it's like there's so many nuances and complexities when it comes to interacting with kids and dogs. So yeah, but with your question, some things that we can, I would say, work on specifically is desensitization. So intentionally creating scenarios to work the dog through and normalize. And I think that would be step one for me, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen lots of dogs that come into your practice that are not comfortable, nervous. I mean, they're being poked and prodded, handled by people they're not familiar with. What are some signs that you've seen, some stress signals from dogs that you think would be good for people to know?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the clear ones we talked about is the tail position, usually down. Maybe they're hiding behind the owner. Again, they're fearful for what's going to happen. So we really work on fear-free philosophy to try and encourage the dogs to be a little more comfortable. So like my first time meeting them, I'll try and make it a really fun experience.
Yeah.
So, but when we add kids in the mix, and I've seen this many a time where the kids come in and they're kind of nervous too, because I'm a doctor, right?
Yeah.
So the kids are like, oh, am I going to get a shot too? So I usually try and break the ice with them so that they're not intentionally hurting or interfering with a dog who's already nervous.
Gotcha.
So I think that's a really important part. So I'll usually give the kids something to play with, like a fake syringe or a little glove if they're old enough to play with those. And then they can let me do my job without risk of a nervous dog
That makes sense.
snapping at the kids.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like if kids are involved in the interaction with the dog, that they can play a role in how the dog responds? Like if the kids are nervous, maybe the dog is nervous too?
Oh, definitely. But I also feel like with kids, if you're very specific on a direction, so if you tell a child like, okay, can you go feed the dog? For them, that's a big vague term. What does feed the dog mean? Mm-hmm. But if you're like, here is 1 cup of kibble and you're going to put it in their bowl right now, then the specific directions make them feel really important. They successfully completed their task. So during the exams as a veterinarian, I'll also get my stethoscope out. If the kids want to do it, then I'll put it on their ears and they can listen to the dog's heart. And so suddenly they're very well behaved. The dogs get like, okay, this is a good role here. Yeah. So
that's actually funny you say that, because I find that we can do the same things with dogs. Like in a situation where they're at the vet's office, I've instructed clients to ask the dog to do known behaviors like shake, lay down, sit, roll over, just to kind of put their mind in a familiar place while they're in an unfamiliar situation.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I love that correlation. Do you think that kids and dogs naturally know how to interact with each other?
Probably not. I mean, I always think of like dogs when you watch, especially young dogs playing together, they hold each other on the ground and wrestle and, full mouth to mouth. And then kids, same thing, they're running around, they trip each other and they laugh and giggle. And so when you put those two together, there's going to be slightly a disconnect on their play. Yep. So giving kids specific roles, like here's how we're going to play. We're going to play sit and stay and shake, might be better suited, for a safe interaction.
Definitely. Like giving them the guidance to work with the dog and for things that the dog already understands.
Exactly. Because then the dog's like, oh, okay, this is a small human telling me the same things I'm already familiar with.
Exactly. Now, do you think that having some foundations for dogs in terms of behavior is a good approach when interacting with children?
Yeah, because, well, as you know, behaviors and personalities for dogs vary a lot.
Absolutely.
There's very easygoing dogs. My dog is one of them who is very cool about everything. There's dogs that are nervous about everything. So finding a happy medium and working with a trainer like you really helps people to better understand their dog and what is safe to interact.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to teach my clients is the place command for their dog. So for example, like Logan, he's on place right now. So if we're in a home and there's let's say a kid's party, that's the safe space for the dog essentially, where they have their own little area to be in. And now the rules surrounding that would be that no one's allowed to go and sort of bother the dog. And so we can invite the dog off the bed, for example, to come and interact. For me, another foundation I always like to implement is making sure that all interactions between children and dogs are supervised, just because it's so important to be able to guide both the dog and the child. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it too. Like kids they do some funny things when it comes to just, first of all, just being a child. And secondly, when it comes to animals, I think that they're curious. And
that's very true. Yeah. So Antonio, what are some easy ways for families to try and desensitize dogs, to kids' noises? I love to use food. I think food is probably one of the number one and easiest motivators for dogs because they're always going to eat. So I try to draw positive associations between kids, between their actions and the sounds that they make. Another thing that I love to do with my clients is to work play into it. So I have rehabbed so many dogs through play by getting them to loosen up. So I always tell people that the way that we interact in the moment and in the world, so to speak, with the dog plays a huge role in how they feel about the situation. So if I have kids that are running around going crazy and I have a dog that is motivated by a toy, I'll say, let's turn the kids' playtime and their craziness into playtime for the dog. And the message to the dog is really like, yeah, who cares what they're doing? We're doing our own thing, which is why it's so important to use those motivators in a way that can be beneficial for the dog rather than just like giving them their stuff whenever they want. And then the kids come over and the dog has no interest in the toy. Right. And I also think there's a fine line between desensitizing somebody's, a dog to certain stimuli and also just creating more fear.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sometimes people push dogs too much. Yeah. And so it's more, they have this idea of like, push harder and then eventually it'll change. And that's not always the case. So for me, I think, as we mentioned before, like every dog has their own personality and they're an individual. So understanding the dog and working with them as an individual. And I've had plenty of dogs that I've worked with where, we'll put a little pressure on them and then you start to realize like that's not going to be a good approach for them. And I think that's important. So for example, if you have a child and the dog is nervous of a kid running around, having the child run right next to them is probably not the best approach.
Right.
Create some space, give the dog the opportunity to create distance themselves if they feel like that's the best thing for them. And like being able to recognize that is just so important, especially when we're talking about kids and dogs.
Like you said, supervision.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's probably my number one recommendation for anybody that has children and dogs is to, first of all, learn dog body language. I think that's very important. The subtle cues and signs that dogs give, like whale eye, their eyes get really big or their ears get pinned back. A lot of times, just like people, if you're doing something that I think is weird, I might make a funny face.
Right.
And so a lot of that, what I'm going through is expressed through my face. Dogs are the same way. If you're really paying attention, then you'll notice that a dog might turn away. It's showing that they're not interested, or their ears go back. They're kind of like freezing, for example. So all that stuff is just it's there. It's always there. But a lot of people just don't realize it because they're not paying enough attention. So that supervision also requires you to like know what you're looking at. In your experience, do you find that there are any breeds that are either better with children or not so good with kids?
Well, there's a lot of stereotypes with breeds, but
Yeah.
I will say that every dog has its own personality.
I agree.
I will say that some of the more nervous dogs, in general, their personalities, I do feel like any herding dog tends to be a little more anxious because they're responsible for doing hard work on on a ranch sometimes, or that's what their DNA tells them. So I feel like they're more aware of their surroundings, more hyper vigilant.
Yes.
So any herding breed probably be a little extra, have my eyebrows up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like working dogs are kind of bred and genetically programmed to have jobs to do. So they're always kind of ready to go and on the move. And especially in today's world, a lot of times dogs aren't really getting the fulfillment that they need.
Yes.
And then when you have that anxious dog ready to go, not being fulfilled, and then you have a kid running around them, they're ready to go and do their job, but yet they're not allowed to do it and kind of being refrained from doing so, or maybe even getting in trouble for doing it too, which honestly brings me to another point with regard to punishing dogs for natural behavior and also warning signals. This is something I talk about a lot, where if a dog growls at a child, a lot of people instantly want to punish the dog for that. And I just totally disagree with that.
Yes. As a veterinarian, I appreciate when a dog growls because they're telling me, they're giving me a heads up. I'm uncomfortable with something. Before I actually bite you, I'm going to give you a warning. So I'm like, well, thank you.
Yeah, that. And also I would say like that's more obvious, the growl. And a subtle sign too, again, is just like a dog turning away and not wanting to interact. One big thing I see with regard to kids wanting to interact and pet dogs are dogs moving away from them.
Oh,
and children sort of running them down to try and pet them and interact with them. And a lot of times people just totally miss that because it's so subtle, right? I mean, the dog isn't necessarily doing anything wrong. And sometimes people think like if the dog had a problem, if the dog didn't want to interact, then they would be more clear about that. And that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's just turning away. And oftentimes people look at it like if the dog is not being aggressive, that therefore that they're okay with it. And I totally disagree with that.
So how do you teach the children then if they, when a dog doesn't mind being petted?
First, I always like to start with the parents. So that's number one, because depending on the child's age, I would say that that's a big factor. So how much do they understand?
Yeah.
And I've tried to frame it to children to try to get them to put themselves in the dog's position.
And I know that's very difficult sometimes for them to understand. Like you wouldn't want somebody up in your face, necessarily, like we have personal space.
Yep.
But using game choices, again, giving the child something very specific to do that is going to be a safe interaction.
Yeah.
That's probably really helpful. So again, I usually when they're at the vet's hospital, I'll, give them a task. Here's your task,
Yeah.
You need to hold on to my otoscope so that I can look at the ears, and then they feel important. So then we end up not having any, clashes.
Okay. So one of my absolute favorite ways to teach kids to interact with dogs is like this. I have my clients take the dog's favorite toy and a leash. So you can get any leash that you have in the house. Take the handle of the leash, okay? So you got the loop, and you're going to pretty much throw the snap end of the leash through the handle.
Okay.
And you have the toy in the middle, and you kind of tighten it.
Oh.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
So now you've got the toy at the end of the leash, and you can drop the toy on the ground and control it with the leash.
Oh.
And that's one of my favorite ways to have kids play with dogs for a couple reasons. One, because the dog has a natural desire to chase the toy. And we've taken the toy away from the child's hand.
Yeah.
Right? Because even though the dog is being playful, we're still risking the child getting nipped by the dog if they're biting for the toy. Kids love to run around and they love to make a ruckus. So what I've had many of my clients do with their children is do just that, set up the leash like that with the toy, and then the kid can run around and just wiggle the toy around for the dog. The kids love it because they get to see their dog have fun, and the parents love it because they don't have to worry about their kids getting bit by the dog, especially in that playful scenario. Another thing that I love to do is have kids play a little recall game. And basically I have the child take a bunch of the dog's food, and I tell them, I say, hold in one hand, you have as much food as kibble or whatever you have, treats as you can hold in one hand, and take one piece and then show it to the dog and then throw it across the room. Let the dog run and go get it. And then the kid runs away from the dog. And when the dog comes to them, they get a piece.
Oh.
Right. So it's kind of like, it's a bit of a recall game. It's kind of the way that I teach
That's
recall.
Very cool. I'm sure the kids love that.
Oh, they do. Yeah, they love it. And then we can also have them include a word like come or here. Another thing I like to do is turn that into hide and seek with the kids.
Yeah.
So the goal is you have the kid throw the food, and then so the kid at first runs, but not too far, so the dog can still see them and they know where they are. And let's say that after a couple of repetitions of that, then the kid hides behind a wall, which is just where they were, right?
Yes.
So now the dog is like, hey, where are you? And then they turn a wall and then they see the kid. And then continue to do that. Basically, make it more and more difficult for the dog. So throw the food, run away. Now they go hide into a room.
Hide and seek. I love it.
Yeah, it's great. No, the kids love it too, because it's just, they see their excitement in their dog.
Yeah, so that's a very safe way to interact. And I also feel like, the dog has fun, and it does sort of put the child in the position of power. Or I don't mean power as
I know what you mean.
Strong, but they're in control of the play that's going on.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I think that's healthy for a dog.
Yeah, and also it creates, one of the things that I tell my clients when I'm doing this, because I'm looking at it from a psychological perspective too, the dog is getting used to approaching the child, versus a lot of times it's the kid who's always running up on the dog. And so this is where a lot of issues can come into play, because the dog is laying down comfortably, the kid is like running at them, or even in play, the kid is running at the dog and the dog is like, whoa, you're coming in hot. So from the perspective of getting the dog comfortable, that's one of my favorite ways. Having the kid, because even with the toy, the dog is running after the kid. So they're getting used to coming up to the child and having this positive interaction, versus the other way around, where we might be putting too much pressure on the dog unknowingly. All right, so this is our Ask Me Anything section, which I love. So the first one is, does my dog actually recognize that my child is a kid, or just see them as a small adult?
So that's a very good question.
Yeah.
Of course, there is no 100% right answer.
Yep.
I personally think that dogs do recognize that they're not quite mature.
Okay.
But they also see them as a small human.
Yes.
And I will say, my own dog, when my kids were little, he thought that was amazing that there was a small human that he could control.
Mm-hmm. When I see this question, I think to myself, do they recognize that the innocence of a child? Sometimes people, I think they anthropomorphize, right? They think that dogs have the ability to sense things that we sense. Like, we look at a child and we understand that they're innocent. They don't know a lot. They are more fragile. I don't think that's the case for dogs.
No.
I think sometimes dogs can learn to be, or maybe just naturally be, very gentle, just as a personality trait. But like recognizing that a child can't necessarily, like for example, a kid playing tug with a dog, that dog was going to rip that tug.
Yeah, the dog's going to win.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're not going to be more gentle because it's a 5-year-old doing it versus the adult doing it. So recognizing differences in behavior with children, absolutely. Sometimes dogs look at kids like, what's going on with them? They're a little weird, All right, so next question. We're expecting a baby. Would training be helpful before they arrive?
I think that's a pretty obvious answer.
Yeah, I know.
Of course, it would be really, really important. So, and I do think that being proactive, seeking out training, speaking with an expert like yourself to go, okay, here, what is my task list? Because once the baby's born, you're overwhelmed and there's a lot to do. So already having your plan in place is very, very smart.
I totally agree. I've helped many clients with this question. So yeah, yes, training would absolutely be helpful, but some like tips that I would offer viewers. Number one is definitely teach the dog place training. Give them their own space and make it a part of the daily routine, because it's going to be very helpful as a new parent when you have a lot of things going on and you need the dog out of the way and not getting under your feet, things like that. Another good thing that I tell people to do is normalize certain things that you're going to use. For example, a lot of people already have strollers, car seats, things like that. So desensitize and normalize the dog to those things. Same thing with sounds and smells. Get the dog familiar with them before baby arrives. And that'll be really helpful to kind of set the tone for when the baby's actually there. It won't be so abnormal for the dog to see you carrying certain things or smelling a certain, like the formula or whatever they're going to use. Another thing that I love to tell people to do, and this seems a little weird, but like get the dog used to actually hearing baby sounds.
Oh,
some dogs,
so you could play it on your phone?
Yeah. So I tell them to, look up a baby crying on YouTube and even go through the whole motion of like having something, put the phone in like a little swaddle.
I love it.
So just, again, normalizing and desensitizing these things is
Sounds,
really, really
smells,
important. Yeah. As much as you can possibly think of.
Yeah.
And one last thing I tell people too is think about when your baby arrives, you're going to give a lot less attention to the dog, and they recognize that. So from their perspective, they got all the attention, and then now this new person arrives and now they get none. So I actually tell people to start I'll say ignoring, but give the dog a little bit less attention early on before baby arrives. And that can be hard to do for people, but it's important because we want to try to set a baseline. And then also when baby's around, try if you feel it's okay to invite the dog into that space a lot. So being mindful about the fact that dogs are social, emotional animals. And so we don't want them to feel completely neglected now that the baby's here.
No, I also think, again, I'm a strong believer in that dogs are all about the pack.
Yeah.
So if they recognize this is a new addition to the pack, it's not like that the dog is now leaving the pack.
Correct. Yeah.
So they're included in a safe manner.
Exactly. Yeah. And intentionally included as well.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So next one, would enrichment games be helpful for a dog and kid?
Oh, absolutely. And you probably are very aware of great enrichment games.
Yes.
But I know I've seen a lot of my clients use those little puzzle games where you hide the treats.
Yep.
And that's fun for kids to actually be involved doing that. Like they can hide the treats in there and close it up and then give it to the dog. And the dog, so they each have something to do.
Yes, I love that. And also I try to encourage people to have like an enrichment game, like a puzzle feeder, for example, or an interactive feeder where the dog has to mess with it and then food falls out.
Yeah.
Give the dog that while the children are also having their own enrichment games.
Right.
I generally try to encourage people to have, what's up, buddy? Welcome back. I generally try to have people put their dogs and kids on a similar schedule.
Oh,
so
smart.
Yeah. Well, this way, at least as much as possible, that may work for their schedule, the person, but at least this way, there's some routine involved in the daily life and you're not kind of overwhelmed with like everything at the same time. So when the kids are down, maybe that's a good time for the dog to be down. Or if it works better for your schedule, maybe when the kids are down, that's when you engage with your dog.
You have your attention for your dog.
Exactly. Yeah. So this way, everybody's getting what they need and being fulfilled. All right. So next question. When my child sees a dog, they automatically want to go up and pet it. How can I help explain the best way to approach a strange dog and that other dogs may not have or like experience with kids?
Okay, my favorite children that I meet when I'm taking my dog on a walk are the ones that walk up to me and say, "Excuse me, ma'am, may I pet your dog?"
Love that.
And so I think that's something that all parents can teach the children.
Yep.
Like, those are somebody else's dog. Your rule number one and the most important rule is ask.
Yes.
And so when they ask me, I say yes, and then I'm there to supervise.
Yeah.
Yes, you can pat him right here. And my dog's really good, so I'm not worried. But again, if it was a dog that, even if it was really cute and fluffy, those cute little ones, the owners can politely decline.
Yes. I love to add to that because I've done many bite prevention workshops and I do them for free because I want people to be educated on this topic. And in my career, I've asked many people, how is your dog with children? And oftentimes the way that they respond to me tells me that they're not 100% sure. Their dog may have interacted with children, but nothing's ever happened. So they're like, I guess they're okay. And that's concerning to me because you don't really know. That's what that tells me. So here's what I tell all of my parents to do when it comes to their children interacting with strange dogs. I love the idea of teaching their children to ask the owner for permission, but I like to take it a step further and say, let's ask the dog.
Oh.
Because if a child walks up to me and Logan and says, hey, can I pet your dog? And I say, yes. What's the first thing that child's going to do? They're going to run up to Logan and they're going to put their hand in his face.
Yeah.
And Logan is comfortable, but he will be a little bit taken aback by a behavior like that.
Yes.
So what I teach everybody to do with their children is this. Have the child ask the person, can I pet your dog? Yes. And then we ask the dog. How do we do that? I like to say kiss, clap, and get back. So the idea is if you make a kiss noise and you clap and you move back and maybe put your hand out, you can invite the dog into the space.
Oh, smart.
And just as we mentioned earlier, like running around the house, having the dog come and take food, or, you know, having the dog chase the kid with a toy, that's the idea. That the mentality is bring the dog into the child. If the dog doesn't want to interact with the child, then they won't. But one of the worst things you can do, especially with a strange dog, is allow your child to just run up to the dog, because most children are going to hover over the dog. They're going to try to hug the dog and they're going to put their hand all in the dog's face.
And I think kids could get the concept, you know, as I can understand, I asked the parent and then the parent would say, let's ask the dog.
Yeah. Dr. Kathy, it's been so great having you on. I could literally talk about this topic all day long. I love talking about dogs. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's really been my pleasure being here.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Don't leave yet. I just want to say, if you want to hear more about health and pet care, check out these episodes of Care Experts. Also, before you go, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. New episodes drop every Wednesday. You don't want to miss it.